my presentation. Quite interesting.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're just about to get underway. Thank you so much for coming tonight. My name's Soutphommasane and I'm Race Discrimination Commissioner here at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge my fellow Commissioner, Susan Ryan, Age and Discrimination Commissioner, and ladies and gentlemen. There are really two questions which explain tonight's event. What is casual racism and what can we do about it? There are many faces today to racism and bigotry. In the past week or so, we've seen it on display in Brisbane. You've probably seen footage of a train guard being on the receiving end of a barrage of racial abuse from a young man. We've seen it as well through the numerous incidents of people abusing, threatening and attacking people of Muslim background. But what about those incidents that fall short of vilification or violence? What about those incidents where things are said as jokes or as offhanded comments? Does something warrant being described as racist if it isn't accompanied by a belief in racial superiority, or if it isn't accompanied by malicious intent? And exactly why should we care about casual racism? I mentioned those examples earlier. Shouldn't we be more concerned about more serious forms of prejudice and discrimination? And finally, what should we do when we are confronted by expressions of prejudice and intolerance? Well, these are some of the questions that we'll be throwing to our panel tonight, and I'm delighted to introduce to you a panel of experts that we've put together to take us through these difficult and sensitive questions around race. Before I introduce our panelists, a quick rundown on how we'll run this evening. I'll ask each of the panelists to open up with some short remarks of 3 minutes or so before we have a moderated discussion with the panel, and then we'll open it up to the floor for you, for your questions to the panelists. So if you have some questions in mind, then do have them at the ready when we open it up to the floor, and there'll be roving microphones at that time. But let me now introduce our panelists. From your left to right, we have Hakan, Harman, Mariam Veiszadeh and Noel White. Let me introduce Hakan first. Hakan is CEO of Multicultural New South Wales, a position he's held since the start of this year. He was previously the Chief Operating Officer at the State Library of New South Wales and has also worked as an executive in the private sector. Since becoming CEO of Multicultural New South Wales, Hakan has led a review of the organisation and developed a new vision for cultural diversity in New South Wales. And one of the things that he did in his first few months on the job was sign up Multicultural New South Wales to our Racism It Stops With Me campaign. He's a passionate advocate for multiculturalism and social justice. I'm told matched only by his passion for football of the round ball variety. We have Mariam Veiszadeh. Mariam is a lawyer, rights advocate, and is one of the energetic young leaders of the Australian Muslim community. She is an ambassador for the Welcome to Australia organisation and a founder of the WISH, Women in Solidarity with Hijabis social media campaign, and also the Islamophobia Register Australia. A dedicated campaigner, Mariam's work has been reported widely in the media, particularly in recent times, concerning Muslim Australians and community harmony. And our third member of the panel is His Excellency Noel White, who is Ireland's ambassador to Australia. He took up his post in Canberra in January 2012. A career diplomat, Noel was previously the Director of Press and Information at Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He has also served as a Director in Irish Aid, Ireland's development aid program, and has had postings in Brussels, Luxembourg, and Strasbourg. And Noel is a committed fan of football of the other variety with the oval ball, namely a committed Brumbies fan, I believe. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel for this evening. And Hakan, I might ask for you to kick proceedings off by giving us a few of your thoughts on what casual racism means and why it matters, in your opinion.
Thanks, Tim. And I might explain. Apparently, I've been given this mic because the word's out that I happen to like karaoke. There's actually at least one person who's in the crowd who's actually been to my place at a New Year's Eve function where I wouldn't even let the microphone go. Look, Tim, thanks very much for inviting me today. In terms of, I might approach this slightly differently. Multicultural New South Wales, or which is going to be our name, Multicultural New South Wales, its genesis is the Ethnic Affairs Commission. It was created as the agency within New South Wales to be a representative for ethnic minorities in 1977. It was the first agency within Australia to adopt, or the first state within Australia to adopt the principles for a multicultural state, and the second in the world behind the Canadians. In terms of our remit, we are responsible for building and maintaining a socially cohesive and harmonious community. One of our specific responsibilities is to ensure that everybody within New South Wales, irrespective of their race, their religion, their ethnicity, their religious beliefs, and so forth, are free to profess, practice and participate in decision-making and participate equitably with equitable access to services and programs. As Tim rightly said, since coming on board as Chief Executive Officer early this year, I was given a remit to reform and review everything that we do as an agency. So we have a grants program, and from that grants program, which was revamped, and we've got a number of new categories, and we proposed to our advisory board, given the current climate, that some of the priority areas should be aimed towards building social cohesion within communities, and specifically we've referenced to counter racism within our communities. We do a whole range of other activities. Community engagement is the core of what we do, and that's how we bring communities together who may have differences of opinion, and we're there to listen, to engage, and enable them to come together and unite as Australians. For me, in terms of what we do to espouse a counter racism view is really the core of what we do, of our work. So from my perspective, it is extremely important, and I think about casual racism as I've been reflecting in preparing for this, Tim, is I think we're probably all guilty of it. At any point in time when you look at it in those contexts. But, you know, I wear many hats. A lot of it is to celebrate our diversity. Some of it is to bring communities together that have different views. And in a nation where we have the world represented, which is quite different to some of the other parts of Europe in particular, I think we have a significant role to play globally. And yesterday I was in Canberra at the Settlement Outcomes group, and we had a presentation by Professor Andrew Marcus on the Social Cohesion Index. And that has been running consistently since 2007. And what that says is 90% of Australians, on average, year on year, understand and accept and support cultural diversity as a strength of our nation. They do also track racism, and in particular around new arrivals, in particular around asylum seekers. There has been an increase in racism. So I like to think that we need to be mindful of the fact of our success. And for me, I'd like to think that from our perspective, whilst we continue to do work to ensure that racism is not tolerated in any form, shape or form, for me, the most important thing in that is, as Multicultural New South Wales, is to partner with other partners in developing cultural competence right across from our education system, which having said that, I was speaking to some other individuals earlier, I actually think our young ones get it. I actually think we make a lot more of it, and from the media, as we see, and we do see things that are just horrific and they should never be tolerated, but I really take heart at the initiatives that were mentioned. I take heart at what happened in Newcastle. A couple of skateboard riders came to the rescue. And what we've been hearing from community leaders, how Australians generally, being a nation built on migration, I think we're compassionate, we have a lot of empathy, and I think we need to rally behind our strengths and our unity. And a lot of the conversation for me is around the centre and the core. Those of us, the 90% that get it, I think that's where our focus and the celebration needs to be, and a total condemnation of anything that is what I consider on the extremes. So if I may stop there. Thank you, Tim.
Well, thanks, Hakan, and thanks for teasing us there with that remark about us all being casual racists. I might come back to you on that a bit later. Let me turn to Mariam now, and Mariam, perhaps you can give us some of your thoughts on casual racism and why you think it matters.
Sure. In terms of casual racism, I think this discussion is incredibly timely. But as I was telling Tim, given some of the work that I'm currently doing, you know, the experiences that I'm hearing about and seeing myself, unfortunately, I wouldn't classify them as casual racism. At the moment, the climate of fear that exists means that many visible Muslims are actually experiencing overt types of racism and discrimination, xenophobia, and ultimately Islamophobia. And that would only mean the conclusion we can draw is that casual racism, which is the more prominent form of racism that would normally occur, is probably on the rise as well. So if we're seeing examples of overt racism happening where people perhaps would otherwise be embarrassed or not have the guts to do something so full on, it means that casual racism is obviously on the rise. And from just simple examples that I've been hearing about, whether it's for me personally, prior to I suppose the last few months, but the last few years, the most common example I would normally encounter is walking into a room or walking into a shop or whatever the circumstances might be, and someone sort of speaking slowly to you and saying, do you, it's that typical, do you understand what I'm saying, that kind of thing. Anyway, don't mind the accent. And then being, pleasantly surprised, I suppose, when they see that, oh, I can actually speak English. Or other examples, humorous examples is I had one gentleman who lived in the same block of units as we did when my husband and I first moved there. And, he said to me, after having a general conversation about where I'm from, etc., etc., and told him I'm from Afghanistan and my husband is Iranian, and literally the first thing he said to me was, you speak very good English for someone who comes from a country full of turmoil, which I just thought was hilarious. But I digress. So I suppose the key message is right now, unfortunately, we're seeing, obviously a rise in casual racism, but overt forms of racism and discrimination, which is very worrying because the main victims are Muslim women and children. But we'll get into that a little bit later.
Thank you, Mariam. I think you give us some very illustrative examples there of casual racism, but also placed our discussion today in some broader context as well. And I think we'll get into that relationship between casual racism and other forms of racism in our discussion. And finally, over to you, Noel. What does casual racism mean to you?
Tim, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I suppose the only reason I'm here today is because you and I have come in contact with one another, and if you and I have come in contact with one another, it's by definition for a bad reason. So
not always, no. I assure everyone. No.
No, I think we can develop the relationship around football and netball and other things. So, but it started.
I'm more a TAR supporter, so we might.
It may not end well. But it's a very interesting discussion. I'm delighted to be here to be a part of this and to share a platform with these other speakers. I'm very wary of the word racism, and when I have dealt with this in the past, I have tended to in the Irish case, I've tended to steer away from the racism word, not because I don't believe that there isn't racism involved and that Irish people suffer from racism, but rather because it tends to degenerate into an argument about whether it's racism or whether it's stereotyping. I mean, quite frankly, it doesn't matter if it's offensive, and if the person receiving it receives it in an offensive way. So having said that, I have been involved with this issue in one form or another since I took up my posting. I was quite surprised by that. I expected to be dealing with other issues, but this has been a recurring theme that has come through, generally through commentary in the media and elsewhere. Ireland is not a country that one immediately thinks of in these terms. Certainly our inward experience has been, certainly to the mid-90s, has been of a country of net emigration. And it was only in the mid-90s that we started to become a country of net immigration and started to have to deal at that stage as a country with the whole issue of integration of other races and other nationalities into Ireland and into Irish society. And that's a journey we're on. It's an interesting and a challenging journey that we're on. On the other hand, on the external side of this, we have considerable experience going back centuries of the impact of what some people would call casual racism, others would call prejudicial stereotyping, simple stereotyping, or just simply bad behavior. And that is something that, I mean, we only have a certain amount of time tonight. I could bring it back to the 12th century and the basis for the Norman invasion and how this was set up and how the Irish were somehow depicted as a lesser nation and that they needed the intervention of the Normans and others to set them right. But let's skip forward into the 19th century. I've mentioned in the past the caricatures, the depiction of the Irish as being somewhat subhuman almost, classically in the Punch cartoons that some people would be familiar with, both in the UK and in the US, presumably for some political motivation, but again, we don't have time to go into that. The fact is that this is what was done, but it creates then a subliminal tension, something which is burnished onto the DNA and provokes a reaction when we move forward into the 21st century. And we find commentary which is loose, ill-informed, unhelpful, and frankly prejudicial about the Irish, as though the Irish behave in a particular way all of the time. And so it has been interesting and disappointing to have to deal with it through this posting here. This is not something which is peculiar to Australia. My colleagues around the world deal with this in various forms elsewhere. But it is something which is challenging. It's a fascinating discussion which has the merit also of being extremely important, and I'm happy to develop any of those themes. Could I just say in one point, just in conclusion, in terms of introductory remarks, this business of racism or not racism and so on. I believe there is a deleterious effect, an impact of all of this stuff. You know, you want to come to that question. It's not simply a case of opposing this because it's wrong or bad, or because opposing it because it's a matter of public policy. One ought to, but there is actually a serious and real negative impact, which is intergenerational, when people are constantly described in a particular way. It's a corrosive effect and it becomes an accepted reality, and has a very bad impact on confidence throughout a nation, throughout a people. There are cases where commentary is simply downright racist. If you say, for instance, that a job as a plumber is available and you require the following skill sets, full stop, and then you add no Irish need apply, well, that's racist, frankly. So you can move beyond that. But in general terms, I'm dealing with prejudicial, unpleasant, and unwelcome stereotyping, which needs to be addressed each time it arises. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel, and I think you have pointed us to some of the questions that we'll have to be asking later. And I will come to the audience for questions at the end of our moderated discussion. But stereotypes, I think, are central to this discussion. But I might turn to you first, Mariam, because you've put it into context. Casual racism is one of the issues around race at the moment. But given other forms of racism, could it be the case that talking about casual racism is unhelpful? I mean, doesn't casual, for example, imply that something is happening on an irregular basis when, in fact, current experience may suggest that racial prejudice and discrimination may be directed at particular groups on more than an irregular basis. So how do you make sense of the current context, and how would you define casual racism if we did have to define it?
That's a really good question, because I probably pose it back to you as well. What is casual racism? And I'm sure there's probably...
You might have to move the mic up just a little, Mariam.
Okay, can you hear me now? I might need the karaoke mic. Okay. Ironically, I don't usually need a microphone because I'm quite loud, but I'll turn it down for tonight. In terms of casual racism, you're right. In terms of defining it, I'm sure there's a dictionary definition for it, but even labeling it casual, does it suggest somehow that it is casual and therefore it's somehow okay? I asked friends about examples of casual racism that they've experienced, and a lot of them indicated to me that often when someone does make a remark that they would classify as casual racism, that it also comes in the form of a joke. So it's kind of like they'll make the remark and then sort of laugh it off and say, oh yeah, that's right, I'm not racist because it's, just a joke. But it's often those specific examples coupled with the climate. I think the climate makes a big difference, because some remarks under normal circumstances could be something that may not be as offensive, still wrong, still racism, but not as offensive. But in the existing climate, for example, to make remarks to visibly Muslim women or visibly Muslim men can be offensive given the existing climate. So perhaps we need to redefine it, perhaps we need to label it differently. But at the moment, from what I'm hearing, there's plenty of casual racism being thrown around.
Well, in the current climate, of course, we've had in the last few days a debate about whether T-shirts which say "Australia, love it or leave" may constitute racism. I might turn to you now, Hakan, on this, and maybe it's helpful for us to look at particular examples and see whether they constitute something that could be described as casually racist. Hakan, would you describe those T-shirts that I mentioned as a form of racism, and if so, a form of casual racism?
Tim, I don't know that it's actually casual racism or one particular act is actually racist or not so racist. I mean, it's like beauty's in the eye of the beholder. If you make a statement about a certain aspect of an individual, if they take offense to it and you think it's actually done in jest, then it's offensive, then it's racist. I think I think this is a really complex issue, and I'm a little bit, I've got a wide range of views about this, Tim. For me, there is a message in this for all of us that the core of the issues that bind us as human beings, those values are universal. And I think that's what we need to look at. The media doesn't help, but organisations like AEST don't help. We see every day, I mean, we've been doing so many different consultations trying to bring different communities together. One case is the Iraqi community, where recently I've had leaders from the Sunni, the Shia, the Kurdish, the Mandayans, and Yazidis all sort of come together, Australians, to talk about what's happening over there and how communities here as Australians might feel fearful. And I don't think it's particularly just the Muslim population, although they are really, really, really copying it. And I've said on many occasions at the iftar dinner where we made a whole range of speeches, and the context was, Islam is a religion of the world. There's 2.3 billion people that follow that faith, that as well as there are 1.6 billion people who don't need faith to lead in their minds a virtuous life. And not all of those 2.3 billion people can actually be identified what we see, because then what happens is it's those, as you said, those that are visibly identified as looking different than us. And I think we really need to be, and that's why I go back to cultural competence, making people understand that. And I made a statement at lunch again today. We just need to get to this point of being colourblind and blind to people's skin, to what they're wearing, to, you know, the shape of their eyes. But that's for all of us, and that's what the statement I was making. And I think we're all sort of, as soon as you see somebody, you're automatically, your perceptions go into gear, and you start assessing, you start making, you see somebody, they have an Irish accent, or you hear somebody with the name Hakan, oh, where does that come from? And if I said Turkish, they probably automatically go, oh, Turkish, you know, whatever, that they might have a view attached to that. Yeah, so it's such a complex thing. I don't think I've answered your question, Tim, but...
Well, let me ask you a sharper question. And you said earlier that we're all casual racists at some level. Does that mean that we're all racist then?
No, I don't. I think what we need to do is we all have a responsibility, just like we say on different forums when we meet with different communities. As Australians, we all have a responsibility to promote social cohesion, community harmony, respect for each other, and if we take a pledge to live and abide by the rules of our nation, well, they have embedded into our institutional framework and our legislation that we shan't discriminate on people's race, their religion, that they're free to profess, that we can have mosques, synagogues, we can have every kind of, you know, place of worship, and they should all be made to feel welcome. And so,
okay,
probe.
I'll take that as a comment. I might come to you now, Noel, and let's return to something that Mariam touched on earlier about humour and jokes. And of course, we had a conversation earlier this year about one particular attempt at humour, which I think had the effect of offending and demeaning members of the Irish community here in Australia. I'm referring to a headline in the Age newspaper involving Podrick Gaffney, a young Irishman who tragically took his life after an incident involving criminal damage in a hotel. But the headline in the Age newspaper said, "Drunk Paddy's $500,000 flood of tears." Presumably an attempt by the newspaper's headline writers at a pun or at humour. But no, I'm just wondering, with an example like this, where do you draw the line? Because we know that headline writers for newspapers will have to make a living out of writing puns, some good, some bad. But where do you think the line should be drawn when it concerns race and ethnicity?
Thanks, Tim. I think there's a judgment call in this, but I think one has to take a very wide definition of those instances and cases where someone in my position needs to raise a hand and say, look, this is not right, this is not acceptable. But in doing that, there's a judgment call from my point of view as to the strength of the response. So there's a scale of these things. I wouldn't like to suggest there's a hierarchy, but there's a scale in one's mind as to how one responds to these things. So for instance, you talk about casual racism. Let's talk about tedious racism or tedious stereotyping. St. Patrick's Day news.com.au, the 10 best Irish jokes. Well, you know, one doesn't want to be accused of not having a sense of humor, but frankly, it's tedious. You move up the scale, and before you get to Podrick Gaffney, you get to Katie Taylor, Irish, those of you who don't know, world champion, successive world champion, woman boxer for representing Ireland in the Olympics 2012. Beautiful moment in the Olympics in 2012 in the UK, fighting a girl of Irish origin, of an Irish background, fighting who was representing England, representing the UK. It's very nice. It has a lot of resonance in the thing, and the people in the crowd who were following that really understood what was happening, and there was a great empathy between the opposing supporters, if you like. And the headline that comes again, as it happens, from the Age, I don't have a set against the Age, but it happened to be the Age again. That time it was punch drunk, etc., etc. A nation intoxicated by, I'm paraphrasing, a nation intoxicated by young boxer, and it went on, it just got worse. So again, that requires a different reaction, and it got a different reaction. I gave it a different reaction at the time. The Pádraig Gaffney case was particularly troublesome. I should say at the outset that in the commentary that I made on it subsequently, I was very careful to not draw a causal link between what happened ultimately to Pádraig, and I suppose I should actually preface my remarks by expressing my sympathies yet again to his loved ones and to his family, who were very brave and very difficult at a very difficult time. It's been very, very difficult for them. But the issue there, and in terms of response from the embassy, we were mobilizing our response from the moment that this had happened, before we got to the consequences, before we got to the final denouement, if you like, of what happened. I come back to my point about, is it racism, is it stereotyping? Frankly, it doesn't bother me what it is. It's prejudicial, it's unpleasant, and as Hakan said, picking up a point I think I made earlier on, that it is in the eye of the beholder. It is how it is received. If someone tells me subjectively that they feel offended by this, then they are. And who am I to question them as to whether they're offended? And if they say it's because I feel it's racist, well then fine. I'm not going to argue the toss with them about this. It is racist. It's offensive. So we respond in kind, respond strongly. I think it has to be responded to pretty much all the time, but the level of response, as I said at the outset, has to be judged depending on the level of offense. And that's a judgment call that has to be made. But I do think there's a responsibility of people in my position to identify these things and also to articulate a view on behalf of a community. In that case, and I'll just conclude on this point, and we're pushed for time. In that case, there was a spontaneous response from within the Irish community, right across Australia and beyond, was the nature of media nowadays, which is absolutely appalled by this coverage. And it's important to be able to capture that and to articulate that and to say it in a way that people would want that to be said. And hopefully that's what I was aiming at the end. I wrote a piece in the end. Just one small point on it. Looking back over some of the papers on this thing, and there's a discussion to be had around the response of the media and the responsibility of the media in all of this. I noticed on one of the responses to the Katie Taylor report that, again, I'd written my strongly worded letter and so on, and there was a note from the editor to the effect of Fairfax Media regrets if this reporting has caused offence to anybody. Well, come on. It has clearly caused huge upset, which has been clearly articulated right across the internet. And that sort of mealy-mouthed response is simply not acceptable either. And media organizations, I think, need to be made more conscious of that. They need to be made conscious of their, and part of the business of identifying this each time it comes up. Don't get me wrong, I do other things in my job as well. Every moment isn't taken with this, but when it arises, we address it, and we address it appropriately. But part of that is articulating it for people, and the other part is creating a consciousness on the part of the media in particular as to what their responsibilities are.
Well, let's turn from the Irish community to the Muslim community, but we'll stay on the same issue of media responsibility. Mariam, can I ask you, how do you think the Australian media has been reporting the issue of terrorism and community harmony at the moment? Has it been helpful to community relations, or has it contributed to a rise in racism and bigotry?
So you mean the Australian media, not the Australian?
the media in Australia.
Yeah, no, I move it down. Okay, apologies. Can everyone hear me now?
That's good.
That was a joke, but you know what I mean. I don't think the media has helped. I always have to throw the disclaimer out there that I'm married to a journalist, so he gets offended when I bag out the media, openly, and that's not the media is not evil. But certainly there are parts of the media that at times, from my perspective and from, I think I can speak on behalf of many people in the Muslim community, that would suggest that there are some media outlets that it just seems like they're on a mission to demonise the Muslim community in Australia. So it certainly doesn't help the situation, and I think it exacerbates the situation, and some of the reporting is incredibly hostile, it's incredibly sensationalist, and it directly, not just indirectly, but I feel that it directly fuels some of the incidents of Islamophobia that we're seeing. If you look at the front covers of the Daily Telegraph or the Australian, and yes, it does, the repeat offenders tend to be the Murdoch press, it doesn't help the cause at all. In saying that though, there have been examples where, for example, the wrong photograph of, the suspect was published on the front cover of, I think, of a Fairfax paper in Melbourne. So those incidents also don't help the cause. I know you've specifically asked about the media, but I think what adds further fuel is when our politicians in positions of influence, weigh into that debate and actually add, cause further hysteria. So you've got the media and politicians hand in hand, causing a bit of a media stir.
Well, I hope you've got some of your questions ready, because we'll come to you very shortly, but I have one set of questions left for our panel, and that is, how do we combat racial prejudice and discrimination? And I might start with you, Hakan, and perhaps you can give us some thoughts on how you see Multicultural New South Wales's role in combating some of the racism that we've touched on today.
Thanks, Tim. Look, for me, it's about Multicultural New South Wales really getting its message out there through the initiatives articulated in its strategic plan, Harmony in Action. It's a 3-year plan. We plan to work with the media. I think you have made some really valid points there about educating them, working with them, continuing to do our community engagement activities. But it really is, the other thing I think you're spot on the money there is, it's about language. It's about ensuring that the messaging that comes out from this issue is not really something an agency like Multicultural New South Wales can attack and solve. I mean, it's fantastic that we have a race discrimination commissioner. The fact that we have a Multicultural New South Wales, we have similar organisations in every jurisdiction, that we have national policies and frameworks around and legislation around that gives us these protections and freedoms. And I think the other thing is, like, in this space, we do at times really need to concentrate on the positives. Let's stick to the 90% that gets it and elevate that. And that's important for everybody to do, from the media, from our politicians, our community leaders. We can, and we really should condemn, attack, destroy as much as we can whenever we hear any form of extremism, including racism, whether it's casual, intended, ill-intended. If it offends, it should be, subject to criticism and not tolerated. But let's celebrate the success of this wonderful nation. Let's get everybody behind the fact that we're here as Australians, and I think that's got to be the message as well.
Mariam, how do we combat racism, and does reporting incidents of racism matter? How important is it to report something when it does happen?
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly important. Before we set up the register, I sensed that there would have been, hundreds of examples of incidents of Islamophobia or prejudice, I hope everyone can hear me, which would have gone unreported. A lot of people in the community sense that they're sort of wasting their time if they do report it, or they feel that sometimes, if someone wasn't physically attacked, then therefore it's not serious enough for it to be reported. And of course, that's not the case. It's about, taking a stand against all forms of xenophobia. And I might just note that it's not, obviously in the existing climate, Muslims are copying it, but ironically, it's those that, who might not actually be Muslim, but, might be wearing a turban or whatever headgear, and they are also being targeted. So that's important to note, that it's affecting the entire community. And in terms of being able to challenge this, or how can we put a stop to it, I often say to people, you've got to take it back to the basics. And, you know, when I get into some heated discussions, which happens on Twitter almost every day, I get asked to condemn everything under the sun. But I sort of say to people, look, I pose the question to them. Did you have a choice in being born where you were born? Did you have a choice to be born into a wealthy family or a not so wealthy family? I know that I didn't get a choice in being born in Afghanistan. I didn't get a choice to be born during the Soviet War. So why is it then that we pass judgment on other people, whether it's asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, and, you know, pass judgment on them to say, well, you don't belong here. You know, you're not Australian. Or it's un-Australian for you to wear that or do that or say that. So it's really about going back to team humanity, as I like to call it. And of course, we're all part of Team Australia, but the rhetoric around that is divisive. And that's what it's about. And you talked about tolerance and celebration, and something that I've always, a quote that I've always been really fond of is, I don't want to be tolerated. I don't want you to look at me and say, yeah, well, look, I tolerate you. Yep, you have a right to be here. Yes, you look different, but that's fine. You know, I can deal with that. No, I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be celebrated, because I have a lot to offer. And I'm not just talking about me personally, but people like me or anyone that's different to you. We have a lot to offer. And it's what makes this country wonderful. And that's what we need to focus on.
Thank you, Mariam. And a final word to you, Noel. How do we counter prejudice? What do we do?
I think there's a duty, as I suggested earlier on. I think there's a duty on us to identify this, to respond to prejudicial material wherever it appears. There's a couple of aspects to this. One is, I think, in terms of respective communities as well, we need to encourage the sort of behavior which doesn't attract the kind of attention which attracts negative comment, and which leaves the door open to the sort of comment which we're discussing. That's so much for that within the community. I think also there are issues here around the media, and don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are journalists. There are issues here around the media, and there are particular challenges around the media at the moment, around the setup of the media. I'm old-fashioned enough and old enough still to believe in the power of the letter to the editor, but it's a dying thing. It's becoming very, very difficult to respond to a media organization. Organizations themselves, I find, have no difficulty in spraying around comprehensively through their 5 or 6 mastheads a particular piece of egregious material, for example, but trying to get the response to that spread around in the same way is very, very difficult, whether it's the online version, the print version, etc. It tends to be taken up, if at all, by that masthead that you respond to, although it's already elsewhere in the stable of the particular media organization. So I think, to sum up, there are responsibilities within communities, there are responsibilities within the media, and as a baseline, I would say we have to not let it pass if we see something that deserves comment. But finally, on that, I would also say that the response needs to be proportionate. It needs to be thought out if it's to be taken seriously.
Thank you, Noel. So now over to you, and we'll take questions from the floor, and I will emphasize that we'll take questions only. So please, no extensive comments out of respect for the audience, because we've got 10 minutes and we're going to try and get through as many questions as possible. But let's kick off with Kingsley here, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the second row, and then the gentleman over there.
Thank you. My name's Kingsley Lou from Project 18C. We've done a bit of work on racism in the community. My question is, snow, there's about 100 different ways to describe snow. That's how the Eskimos view it. And I would say perhaps it is for racism, but at community level, when one's having a discussion in racism, I want the view of the panel about how difficult or not difficult is it for us to articulate about the categories of racism and how do we measure it?
Okay, so question to the panel on the categories of racism. Perhaps, Mariam, you want to take this one? I mean, is it useful for us to categorize racism in different ways?
Yeah, I think so, because I suppose it is currently categorised as well, at least in a formal capacity when it comes to reporting it, I presume. Probably don't have anything further to add on that, to be honest.
Noel, any quick thoughts on that question?
I think racism is tricky. People struggle with the definition of racism the whole time. I was saying at the outset that sometimes in the Irish context, the discussion around the issues that I have been raising tend to get sidetracked down what I think is a blind alley of is it racism, is it stereotyping, is it prejudice? You know, forget all that. It's not relevant. In any case, racism, the classic definitions of it refer to ethnicity, color, race, nationality, any of these, religion, etc., anything that is used as an incitement to hatred. But I think it's like one of these things that, you know, it's hard to capture it precisely, but we recognize it when we see it.
We have a question from the gentleman here, and then we'll go to the gentleman over there, and then the lady in the peach over there. We'll come back to you very short. We'll get more questions in that way. Please.
You spoke about the media, how the Australian media often indulges in casual or otherwise form of racism. My question is, what about our politicians? They're using casual or other form of racism for political traction. I'm thinking of Team Australia, for instance. Now, surprisingly, no one talked about the role of politicians, and I think that's the sort of elephant in the room, and we should address that.
I had a go at them.
Let's go to Mariam and then Hakan. Mariam?
Sorry, I didn't mean to take. Oh, look, if you want someone to have a go at the politicians, just come to me. I think the point that you raised, I also sort of alluded to that earlier. The people in a position of influence, so not just politicians, but certainly politicians, but we're talking about shock jocks as well. People in a position of influence need to be reminded that they're in a position of influence and responsibility. And it's what can be done when you know, the discrimination and the xenophobia is coming from the Prime Minister, for example. What do you do in those circumstances? Who tells Tony Abbott that he's stepping out of line? You know, we can jump up and down, we can write opinion pieces, and we can write letters to the editor, but ultimately, you know, will it be taken seriously? I don't think so. Unless he sees that there is that, you know, he might suffer in the polls, then I doubt that he will actually take it seriously and seek to stop using that rhetoric. It's incredibly disappointing to see it time and time again. And to be honest, before Tony Abbott was elected, I kind of would have predicted that this would have been the case, but even I did not think that he would go as far as he has. So yeah, I put the question back to everybody else, what can be done about it? And unfortunately, from my position, I feel helpless at times when it comes to specifically Tony Abbott and his team.
Hakan, any thoughts?
We've removed the word race and ethnicity from our legislation and replaced it with ancestry. We think ethnic is something that means foreign, and so for me, I actually did mention that it's not just up to politicians. I think a lot of politicians do actually stand up and say that this is not about a particular religious group. This is about security. But the way things are played out in the media doesn't always go like that. I just go back to my point. It's incumbent on all of us.
Thank you. And we have a question from the gentleman there.
Yes, from all that's been said, I get understanding that we're speaking about or considering the lack of harmony. That being the case, should we then give harmony a chance to evolve naturally rather than force it or engineer it?
Hakan?
I think harmony has come about naturally in a nation that's built on migration. It's a model around the world. It doesn't mean we've got everything perfect. 90% of Australians get cultural diversity and are committed to multiculturalism. They get the fact that we are a nation where the world is represented, and they come to the rescue of people when they witness something that is unjust, unfair, and in their eyes, bigotry, racism. And for me, it's keep it simple, stupid, KISS, right? Racism is racism is racism. If it offends people, it's wrong and it should be condemned.
Noel, any thoughts on whether there are any lessons about harmony that we can take from the experience in Ireland?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Should we suck it up and move on, or should we address it when we see it because we feel it needs to be addressed, and run the risk of drawing further attention to it and adding fuel to the fire of a particular conversation that we found unhelpful from the start? I tend towards the latter, is that or the former rather, is to respond, but the response then needs to be proportionate and correct in terms of the level of offence that's there. I feel Mariam's frustration entirely in this, but what can we do? We can organise events like this. We can write letters to the papers. We can have public dialogue around these issues. These are the tools that are available to us. And at times it's terribly frustrating, but I think nonetheless we have to keep pushing on and doing it that way. I wouldn't presume to give you lessons from the Irish experience in Ireland on this. We're a relative newcomer. I've described the historical context there. To many of these challenges, and we're dealing with them. But the response to your question in terms of the Irish and the Irish here, I think I've addressed.
We have a question there, and I think we have time for one question from Judy in front, please.
Hi, thanks everyone. It's been said repeatedly that if someone finds something offensive, then it's racism and it's wrong. And whilst that has really good uses for some communities in getting us at least first to listen to the person who's making the comments that they're offensive. I'm a little bit wary about using that as the measure of what we find wrong and racist, because I feel like we've probably all met someone, generally a white person, who'll say, oh, I find quotas for Aboriginal students offensive and racist towards me, and I'm offended by that. And I'm hesitant to consider that kind of offence as legitimate as the kind of offence that, let's say, a Muslim woman might experience.
No?
Sorry, Tim, just to come straight back on that, I want to be absolutely clear. That is absolutely not what I said at the outset, that if it's offensive, therefore, ergo, it is racist. What I said was that if somebody is offended by material which is prejudicial, stereotypical, etc., we know the kind of material we're talking about, then it needs to be addressed. And that I find that discussion about, is it racist? Are we a race? Are we a nationality? I find it energy sapping and ultimately pointless. But I want to absolutely correct that point. Thank you.
Mariam, does racism boil down to offence, or should we be considering it in terms of other values or concepts as well?
I think you do need to consider other things. For example, you know, often I have this discussion. They say, well, they might find something that I say offensive, but ultimately you've got to look at it this way: who are the minority groups within the country that you're currently in? So that could be different depending on where you are. But in Australia, we've got specific minority groups who do cop a lot of abuse. And so that's the context that you need to look at. So the example that you're giving of someone else saying, well, I find that offensive because whatever the circumstances might be, that's why the broader context is important. You know, that's not to discount their feelings or that they don't have legitimate grievances. That's not the point. But the point is, it's almost sort of putting it into context and put it into perspective. And that is that there are some people who are coming from a position, you know, they're not, if you look at the bargaining position, they're in a much lower position. And so naturally they're not able to articulate their grievances in a way that someone else could. So that's why the context is important.
So power might matter. We have time for one last question, but I'm sure the panellists who may be able to remain would be happy to take questions after we wrap up. Judy, a quick final question from you.
I think the issue of power is what I was actually raising in terms of institutionalised racism, and in terms of, on one level, it's one thing to say that 80 or 90% of the country believes it's right, but that's not the measure upon which we're here today. So the issues of generalisations, generalisations, prejudice, and those terms, which are normal human responses, and we measure our external world by that. But it's with discrimination and racism and genderism, sexism, ageism, whatever the ism is, it implies an action and some power that's gone in terms to be able to engage in that power over or power within. And I think we really cannot. We have the power in this country to pass legislation overnight to stop a boat from landing when we don't even know who's on it. But do we have the power to actually apply those moderators to this discourse? And the discourse is the issue. The language that's created, Arab equals terrorism equals racism. They're the sorts of issues that I think we really have to start looking at, rather than let's just be harmonious.
Well, thanks, Judy. I'll do my Tony Jones impression. We'll take that as a comment. But on that note, I think we will wrap up this evening's proceedings. And I think power is the appropriate place to end our discussion tonight. One of the goals behind our work here at the Human Rights Commission is to empower people to stand up to racism. That is the fundamental message through our work with Racism It Stops With Me. And the message is very simple. If you see or hear something that may have racist implications, consider saying something if it's safe to do so. You can report it, or you can offer your support and comfort to a target of abuse or intimidation as well. But I think I'll leave the final word to our Australian of the Year, Adam Goods, who's been our campaign ambassador, and it's over to Goodsy. Sorry, Mariam.
A year ago, I took a stand against racism. When you see or hear something racist, it's hard to know what to do, but you can always do something. If it feels safe, you can speak up, or you can report it to someone who can help. But if you say nothing or do nothing, nothing changes. So take a stand.
Racism, it stops with me.
And we also have a few pledge cards around the room. What we do on our website is we post individuals' pledges against racism. So if you do want to take a pledge to say that you're standing up to racism, feel free to grab a pledge card around the room, and we'll take a photo and put it up on our website. But thank you very much for coming, and please help yourself to some refreshments. Thanks.